Day 36. Bathurst to St. John. I woke up in Bathurst, reminiscing on my wonderful time in Quebec. Although it had only been a day, I had already missed Quebec. Although I have been to Bathurst a few times during my childhood, I had practically no memories of being here whatsoever. Given that I wanted to venture much further south in New Brunswick by the Bay of Fundy, I had to move quickly. I fired up my beast, headed over to the nearby Tim Hortons for breakfast, and then headed out. In about 3 hours, I arrived in Fredericton, the capital of New Brunswick. I do vaguely remember visiting Fredericton as a child, but that was so long ago, and again, I had very little connection to this part of New Brunswick. I walked through downtown Fredericton, which had nothing memorable to note aside from its lack of development and general uncleanliness. The people were incredibly friendly, which was the stereotype of Atlantic Canada and the opposite of the West Coast. However, Fredericton definitely had signs of economic downturn. Many of the buildings in its downtown core were run down, and many businesses were closed permanently. I was certain a lot of this was attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic, but generally Atlantic Canada had been suffering economically for decades. I walked around Fredericton after having a quick lunch, trying to find something nice about the city that I could talk about in the future. And I found nothing. I walked along the southern shore of the St. John River just north of downtown along Westmorland Street Bridge. The area was quite filthy, and seeing that there was nothing nice to see or say about the capital of New Brunswick, I departed. After driving south for a few hours, I finally arrived at St. John. This was a city I have never been to before. I drove around looking for a car camping location, which I quickly found at Reversing Falls. By now it was early evening and the weather was still warm, so I decided to explore. Reversing Falls was an interesting place, with the return tide rushing inwards and pushing tremendous amounts of water inland. At low tide, the outflow of water, it was quiet and calm, but at high tide, with the inflow of water from the Bay of Fundy, it was loud and turbulent. I spent some time here before I met some interesting people along the observation point. There was a couple from Vancouver who noticed I had British Columbia plates on my beast. I started a conversation with them, and it turned out they moved to St. John from Vancouver some time ago. And surprisingly, they lived in the same neighborhood that I used to live in back when I lived in Vancouver. We exchanged contact information before we parted ways. It was cool to run into people during my travels. Shortly after, I drove to the Uptown area of St. John, parked my beast over at King Square, and I decided to walk around the area to explore. As again, this was my first time in St. John, I found St. John to be quite different from Fredericton. St. John was a much more working-class city and significantly larger than Fredericton. It seemed like the economic downturn wasn't as prevalent here as it was in Fredericton. While both cities were far from clean, St. John was definitely a lot less refined, much grittier, at least by the downtown core. As I walked through Kings Park and the surrounding Uptown area, I passed by several liquor stores, convenience stores, and a few strip clubs. The sun was beginning to set as I made my way to Market Square, where I found a pedestrian-only area with numerous bars and restaurants that were open for business. It was great to see some economic and social activity during this time of madness. I thought of how I would visit some of these bars and restaurants if I were staying here longer, and possibly meet some local people and for a dinner and a date. But seeing that I was only here for one evening, I continued to explore by the waterfront. I found myself at a pier looking over at the St. John Harbour Bridge and the famous St. John sign in the distance. There was definitely a lot more to see here than Fredericton, and perhaps in the future I would return to explore. New Brunswick, to me, was the Saskatchwan of Atlantic Canada. Nothing special, nothing memorable, and nothing really worth seeing aside from a few bits here or there. But would New Brunswick have been a big surprise to me? Would New Brunswick have a surprise for me? Tomorrow I would find out as I headed back to my beast and back to Reversing Falls for the night, as I knew I had major plans for another adventure tomorrow. Subscribe to the Travel Experience de Voyage channel. Tap the bell and join the conversation on the comment section below.